an Air Force veteran who's being interviewed today. Tom, could you introduce yourself and then talk a little bit about how you chose the Air Force, how you went in that early service, and then we could get into the rest of your story with the interesting aspects of it, of your military career.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. I'm Tom Pillari. I am a 1969 graduate of the United States Air Force Academy and a veteran separating in 78. I originally chose to talk to a recruiter about the Air Force Academy because I was looking for a way to make sure my mom and dad, who were lower blue class, hardworking people, didn't have to pay for college. I was the oldest son. And it turned out I got in. So I went there not thinking really anything at all about the Air Force. And of course, right away, decided that it was a career for me. Not necessarily flying because I'd never done that before. So I entered the academy as the 11th class, if I'm not mistaken, and entered in the summer of 65. And basically had my 4 years there. Everything was good, although like many others, I tried to leave many times, thinking it just wasn't for me. I kept hearing about all my friends in the 60s having these great times at Ohio University and others, and thought maybe I should do something else. But frankly, the good Lord and many officers kept postponing that final interview, and it turned out, of course, that I stayed. As I was approaching the end of my cadet career, the question came, do I want to fly or not? And at that time, graduating in 69, not being a pilot was rare coming out of the academy. But I looked at the number of times that pilots had made me sick. I looked at my training the last summer, my first class summer, when I really just didn't enjoy the flying. And I decided rather that I wanted to do something else. Medical school was not a possibility. Being a so-called ground pounder did not seem like a good idea if there was an alternative. And fortunately, I became close with the law faculty at the academy, and they helped me out. And coincidentally, somebody was visiting Colorado, recruiting for the University of Chicago. And again, the stars aligned, and I got into one of the best schools in the country, the University of Chicago Law School. But it was an interesting time to be there. Entering in 69, opposition to the Vietnam conflict was at its height. There were veterans in my class, but only 2 or 3. And the fact that I was on active duty was not seen as a positive by my classmates, a very liberal place. Many times I would be cornered and blamed for all of the military activities. But it gave me an opportunity to see the Vietnam conflict through civilians' eyes. I had classmates who were drafted, and that was a shock. I made a choice. They had not. And having said that, it didn't change my thoughts about the military, but it was sobering. And it just, as I say, provided a different view. One of the more challenging things is that one of the students killed at the Kent killings was a friend of mine. And so that made things rather tough. Around the campus when that happened, people dug foxholes and did rather silly things that kind of turned me off to that situation. But I got through it. There was, however, one interesting experience with an Air Force reservist that I should mention. Coming out of the Air Force Academy, my writing and verbal skills had not been refined as students from Harvard and Cornell and Yale, Stanford, et cetera, that formed my class at the academy. So it was pretty tough, and I was not doing well in the first 2 quarters. So I chose to transfer. I went down to Ohio State. That would also make it easier for me to pay for school, which I'll explain in a minute. Went down to Ohio State, had an interview. The gentleman I was speaking with was very nice. He said, "We'd love to have you come, but I want to talk to you for a minute." He got up and he shut the door and he said, "I'm an Air Force reservist. Get your butt in gear and get back to Chicago. If you made it through the Air Force Academy, you're going to make it through Chicago." Again, someone entered my life that I can never thank enough. It kicked me in the butt and put me back to Chicago, which was great. But for him, I might have made the change. Now, the reason cost was important is that there is a rider, at least there used to be, named the Goldwater rider, where no money from a defense appropriation bill could be used to pay for law school for regular officers. Have no idea why that was in there, but as a result, I went to law school on a program called excess leave. I tell everybody I was one scintilla away from being a civilian. No pay, time and grade, yes. No allowance for quarters. I had to report to an Air Force base whenever I had more than 2 weeks off. Well, it turned out Air Force Base was Chanute Air Force Base, south of Chicago, about 2.5 hours. The best news about that is that's where I met my beloved Melissa. 51 years later, it's still working out. So I get assigned to Chanute. I come to the end of my 3 years in law school, and it's time to decide where to take the bar exam. So I took it in Massachusetts and later on took it in Ohio. But the reason I took it in Massachusetts, it was given in July. So I graduated early from law school, took the bar exam, was admitted in November, which immediately made me captain because JAGs came in as captain. So the rest of my classmates, unless they were promoted below the zone, had to wait another 6 or 7 months. I always thought that was kind of fun, a little perk of being a JAG. So I get assigned still at Chanute. So now I'm entering into my first years as a licensed attorney. Well, the first thing the Air Force said is I had to go to Maxwell Air Force Base and become competent. That my 3 years at the University of Chicago and passing a bar exam didn't make me competent. And I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but it really was proper. I had to get reintegrated and indoctrinated into the Uniform Code of Military Justice and all the things that a JAG would have to do that I had no experience at law school. So some of my early memories of being at the Air Force, being at Chanute rather as a JAG, start with being counsel to the credit union on base. One day, 3 of the ladies came in mass to my office and said, "We are being sexually harassed by Colonel so-and-so." And I said, somewhat shocked, explain it to me. They did. I had them sign affidavits. I went to the colonel and we stopped that. So in my first exposure to representing somebody, that's how it turned out. My next memory as a young attorney is handling my first defense case. In those days, the Air Force did not provide dedicated defense attorneys. If you were a JAG, you could be judge one day, you could be prosecution, you could be defense. So I was assigned to defend a young man. I frankly don't remember the case, but I know I got him acquitted, which is not easy to do after Article 32 investigations. So I pulled out my book, my diary of cases, and I said, "I'd like you to sign this book." And he turned to the page and he said, "There's nobody else on this page." I said, "Yeah, you're my very first defendant." He was a little surprised, but it turned out to be fun. He was a good man. The next experience that happened at Chanute, I think, well, 2. First one was race relations. The idea that a Caucasian captain would be trusted by a young African-American airman as his defense attorney was not small. And in order for it to work, in those days, they had race relation officers. So if I had a client, a defendant rather, who was African-American, I never met with him without the race relations officer there until we had established some form of trust. After that, it worked out, but it was, again, something the civilian world didn't understand. Lastly, this was a time when homosexuals were really considered to be unacceptable in every way by the service. And many times they could be dismissed with a less than honorable discharge. So one day I was playing baseball for the team at the base, and a young lady came up to me and said she needed to speak to me. It turned out she was homosexual, and asked me to represent her if she was being discharged. And I was able to secure an honorable discharge for her for reasons that are not important. Well, the next thing I knew, I had 4 or 5 more coming in. So I became sort of the confidant, counselor, attorney for this group of people who had done nothing to discredit themselves personally, had violated no laws, but were on the wrong side of Air Force policy at that time. Shortly thereafter, the military or the Air Force, and I think the other services too, but clearly the Air Force decided that it didn't make sense to tell young airmen or anybody else in uniform that the man who prosecuted your buddy yesterday should now defend you. So they created something called the Area Defense Council. And I don't know how my name got involved, but somebody asked me if I would do it. And what happened is I immediately left the staff judge advocate's office physically, moved to another office, had my own staff, 1 associate and 1 non-com to assist. And we became circuit riders in the old days. And I had responsibility for Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin.
Let
And I
me
would
ask you
travel.
one quick question, Tom.
Sure.
What was the attitude of your contemporaries? I mean, you were assigned these cases. You had no prior knowledge. They just, oh, and in fact, your first case, the young lady came to you. What was kind of the attitude of the other JAG officers that you were serving with at Chanute?
In terms of the representation of with the homosexual group, nothing. You do your job, you move on. And the idea of leaving the staff judge advocate's office and creating an independent office where the head, a colonel, had no control over me anymore, that was not liked at all. That's very perceptive. It became a source of great conflict for the year or so that it happened. But we moved on, and as it turned out, I was assigned to Guam. And so my next assignment in 74, I spent 2 years at Chanute, was to go to Guam. When I got there, I was the assistant staff judge advocate. There was a colonel who was the staff judge advocate. While I was there, a number of interesting things happened. First of all, because of the lack of coordination between my sponsor and me, because they didn't have an area defense council there and there was just a lack of communication, I kind of went off on my own. Turns out when I was in San Francisco waiting to get transportation to Guam, I was notified that I was essentially AWOL if I didn't get my behind there pretty quickly. So Melissa and I took off on a C-130. We sat in web seats the whole way. She was actually pregnant at the time and we didn't know it. So 51 years later, I'm still paying for that one. So we got there, and it was a time when the office was trying a lot of cases involving drugs coming in from Thailand and Vietnam. We had large active B-52s, et cetera, at the base. But I was asked one day to answer this question: is the Officers' Wives Club gift shop legitimate? So, little backstory. In the middle of the base, surrounded by 10 feet high barbed wire, was a little building. It was the Officers' Wives gift shop. What would happen as the pilots came back from Thailand and other places, they would bring back with them things called bot chains, ceramic elephants, you name it. And they would bring it to the gift shop. I don't know the details of whether they actually paid for them or not and who paid for it. I'm sure somebody did. So the general assigned this to the staff judge advocate, who said, determine whether it's legit. Long story short, everything about that was not legit. Although they used the proceeds for charity, they did not satisfy any Air Force regulations or, more importantly, any Internal Revenue Code provisions. So after reviewing it, I was asked to meet with the general. And I told him that based on what I saw, he needed to close the gift shop right away. Now, this gift shop was frequented by congressmen, governors, etc., coming through. And so he looked at me very straight and he said, Captain, do you have any idea who the president of the Officers' Wives Club is? And I said, I'm sorry, sir, I don't. He said, it's my wife. You better decide something else other than closing it. So what I did was I recommended certain Internal Revenue Service procedures that would have made them legit. Shortly thereafter, whether connected or not, I was honored by being named the outstanding young staff judge advocate in SAC, and was nominated for something called the Kufeld Award, which is across the entire Air Force, its various subsidiaries. Quite an honor. Didn't get the Kufeld Award, but felt that my efforts were being appreciated, which was great. The last thing of note on Guam, I think, was when the Tet Offensive caused Saigon and the South to fold. A lot of the incoming people from Vietnam came to both Big Navy, which was Agana down at the south end of the island, and came to Andersen Air Force Base. We had them there for probably 2 or 3 days. I was called in to monitor and went on kind of a 24-hour shift doing that. And just looking back, I was a small part of the history of the end of that conflict. Just as I was about to leave, I tried to talk the Air Force Academy in not having me go back there to be on the faculty. But they wanted me to come back there. I was already becoming a little concerned that my legal training was beginning to atrophy. I felt that I wasn't using it. I was becoming an administrator, wasn't trying cases anymore because I was a senior captain. And I think if I look back at the ratings I had at the time, possibly major below the zone. In any case, they didn't buy it. So they said, you're assigned to the Air Force Academy. So in the summer of '76, I reported there. And summer of '76, I reported there when the first class of women came into the academy. Now, when I went, as it was for many classes, there were no women there. And it was a hard thing to wrap your head around. But as I got to know the 200 young women who were the first class of female cadets, I concluded that they were not only the most outstanding women I'd ever met, they were the most outstanding people I'd ever met. What they had to put up with the men's classes ahead of them was somewhat shameful, but understandable. The Bring Me Men sign came down, and a lot of things happened at that time that I think made it tough on them. I have lifelong friends with the ladies because we became their sponsors, and we had the entire basketball team at our house. And it's one of the nicest things that ever happened as part of my career. Well, one of the things that the attorneys assigned to the academy did was to represent cadets in any military matters. And probably the most significant thing that happened to me, which ended my career, was a representation of a young man who had committed an honor violation. He was a fourth classman, and his honor violation was pretty minor. He had indicated outside his door that he was in an authorized place when in fact he wasn't. Somebody noticed it, and he appeared before the honor committee, which I had been a part of when I was a cadet, and the honor committee indicated they did not want to give him discretion and recommended that he be dismissed. In those days, and as far as I know still today, a cadet who was dismissed by the honor committee had the right to appear before a board of officers and make the case that dismissal was inappropriate, that discretion, or one bite at the apple, if you will, should apply. So at that time, I was assigned to be his attorney. I met with him. The facts were clear. I met with his AOC, Air Officer Commanding, and this major had agreed to support the young man by talking about his character in a positive way. So as I was getting ready for the case and getting ready for the birth of our second son, literally in days, I got a call from the attorneys representing this man's father. This man's father was the head of the Mayo Clinic, and the attorneys came in with a lot of power. And as I was speaking to them one night, I said to them, I do not want you to come in to the hearing. It will send a bad message to have people in three-piece suits coming in. I can handle it. Well, the attorney wanted some more assurance. So I explained to him I was a grad. He thought that was a meh kind of thing, that I was part of the Air Force Academy honor committee. Nope, that didn't help. As soon as I told him that it was the University of Chicago that I graduated from, he turned on a dime and said, Counselor, I apologize. You handle it. It's all up to you. So we go to the hearing. The major gets on the witness stand. I said, please tell the board your opinion of cadet so-and-so. And in sum, he said, the guy's a bum. We should throw him out. Well, as an attorney, the one thing you don't want is your witness to be on the witness stand anymore when he's turned on you, because you can't rehabilitate him. So needless to say, the board recommended dismissal. The next morning, I got a call from the major who said, I really want to apologize. I was advised that if I supported your guy, I would not see promotion to lieutenant colonel. Well, the moment he said that, I knew what I had to do. So I created what I called an affidavit of prejudice. Now, for those that might not understand, a base commander, in this case, the superintendent of the Air Force Academy, acts as a quasi-judge, quasi-court of appeals at the same time. So I went to my boss, who was head of the law department, told him I was going to send this to the superintendent, and he said, you do what you have to do, and I sent it off. Well, the proverbial hit the fan, and this unfortunate major called me and said, I'm in more trouble than I was before. I created another affidavit. Well, all of this now is in front of the superintendent, along with the hearing results. And I understand some group called the Board of Officers, the key generals and tenured colonels were going to meet and make a recommendation to the Secretary of the Air Force about whether or not the board decision to dismiss would be honored. And as luck would have it, and as good prayers, I think, had it, they decided against that. In part, I think, because I had explained to my boss, I won't be able to control these civilian attorneys if he gets dismissed, because they know what's happened. I had permission to discuss this with them. So good news, the young man gets to stay. Nice story. He finished his 4 years, wound up in a missile silo, served his 5 years honorably for the Air Force. But the next morning, I went to teach my class at 7:30. I heard a knock on the door at 7:35. You need to see General Tolman now. So I walked across the terrazzo from the education side to the administration side. And it's been many years now, but my memory was I was in what we cadets called a brace for a good 40 minutes in front of his desk while he railed me for not doing the right thing for the Air Force. And how could I have let this happen, et cetera. And finally, I asked him for permission to talk, again, almost like a dually. And he said, go ahead. And I said, it's not my problem. Your people screwed up, wasn't me. So the bottom line was he dismissed me in very abrupt ways, get out. And so I went home that day, turned to Melissa, and I said, we need to get out. This man is very upset, and he may control my career in places that we might not like. So I submitted my resignation. Now, at this time, I was aware that of the 7 of my classmates who had gone to law school, graduating in the class of 69, at that time, I think 5 of them had already separated. And the reason that happens is that even though the Air Force wasn't paying for law school, every day I attended law school, I had to give them another day back, and which was certainly fair enough. Add that to the 5-year commitment from the Air Force Academy. And at this point, in 1978, my time that I owed the service was done in about March or April, something like that. So when I submitted the documents, I said my resignation would be effective after the school year so that I would give the Air Force Academy time to bring somebody in. I got a call from a colonel from Texas, maybe Randolph, and he said, in so many words, who do you think you are? You don't have any right to get out. You owe us another 3 years. I explained to him that the regulations signed by the United States Air Force Chief of Staff didn't agree with him. He basically said, well, that's for the attorneys to decide. And I went, okay. And I did something I never thought I would ever do. I walked into a congresswoman's office, Pat Schroeder in Denver, and I said, this is constitutionally wrong. They're applying the law in a discriminatory way against me, and I don't like it. Well, long story short, feeling very uncomfortable because I still to this day enjoyed my Air Force career. It wound up going to the Secretary of the Air Force. In the meantime, before the decision came down, as the wonderful tradition goes, other members of the law faculty were leaving. So they were having parties for these people. But they came to me and said, we're not including you in the party because as far as we know, you're not going anywhere. And I said, okay. So as I attended the party, I went down to Colorado Springs, went to a costume shop and got a mafiosa outfit with a fedora, with the violin case, with the machine gun, with the spats. And I went to the party. And the lieutenant colonel there said, Tom, what's going on? I said, Dick, Colonel Lee, friend, man I have a lot of respect for. I said, Dick, it's over. It's time for me to go. And so this is just the beginning. And I mentioned Klinger. He started laughing. So ultimately, they came back. The Secretary of the Air Force came back and said my position was correct. They couldn't apply the regulation inconsistently to people in exactly the same situation. So as I was processing out, the gentleman said to me, would you like to be in the reserves? And I said, well, I don't know, what kind of commitment would I have? And he said, oh, you could leave whenever you want. I said, I've heard that story before. I don't think I want to do it. And to fast forward a little bit, transitioning into civilian law practice required literally every minute I had. And so I really couldn't have done much. But there's an interesting postscript to this. The superintendent was also separating that summer. And he wound up at a school in Florida, Embry-Riddle, the large aeronautics program, as I understand. It turned out, strange coincidences, which I think kind of followed me in many positive ways, turned out our law firm, little law firm in Lorain, Ohio, west of Cleveland, was representing Embry-Riddle in a matter. So my partner went down and he said, among other things, here's our invoice, President Tallman. And by the way, the former Captain Tom Pillari is going to get a piece of this invoice when you pay it. And he was apparently startled and said, what are you talking about? My partner explained the circumstance. And to his credit, General Tallman said, you tell Tom I apologize. I cost the Air Force a judge advocate, an Air Force Academy graduate who wanted to serve a full career, and I apologize, I was wrong. So that kind of ended all of my contacts with the military on any kind of active or reserve basis until I saw one day in what we call advance sheets sent out to lawyers in each state, talking about the most recent cases, that sort of thing, but also having want ads in it. So here's a want ad by the Air Force Reserve Air National Guard looking to bring in an attorney. And it starts out by saying, we do not discriminate based on sex, et cetera, age. So I called, spoke to them. And at that time, I think I was in my mid 50s maybe, and spoke to a sergeant who was the intake person, explained my background. And she said, this is great. We'd love to have you. And I said, well, this is my age. And there was this pause. And she said, well, there's no way we can get a dispensation for you for that unless you're a doctor. And I said, well, you might want to change your ad since it says you will not discriminate based on age. So that was it. That's my career. And I don't regret any of it.
The ironic thing is, as we started this interview, Todd and I were talking about the Lioness program, which was in the War on Terror. And in 2004, a group of Army female enlisted people who were in various disciplines were needed to talk to the women in the Afghan community as they were doing insurgents, going in to do extractions and doing their the routine patrols, because women would get really paranoid. They didn't want to talk to men. Men couldn't touch them and, you know, do a search, etc. So they had women doing it, and this was before the law changed. So the regulation and the law said women were not allowed to be in combat,
Right.
and in fact, the Army needed them, and they put them into combat. And later, the Marines did the same thing. So
Yeah.
the program we're doing right now, so years later, the same kind of issues that you had talked about where the law, how it shifts, it hasn't changed. I mean, we're
Yeah.
still struggling with the same kind of issues you were struggling. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who is entering and wants to, because this is something from an enlisted man's point of view, because I served in the Air Force, and the UCMJ was ever present. And it's a totally different kind of a situation than civilian law, as you are well aware. What would you say to people about the efficacy of what goes on in the military as opposed to what goes on in civilian life? Because it seems, on the one hand, we always thought that the UCMJ it was a little bit more fair on one hand. It was more stringent by a long shot, but it was a little bit more fair in some ways. And then to hear that the kind of situations you described, where the politics came in and decisions were being made that may not have been quite as fair. What would your reactions be to that?
Well, I would say, first of all, the jewel of the Uniform Code of Military Justice is the Article 32 proceeding, where, contrasted with grand jury, the defendant or the accused, who hadn't been a defendant yet, had the chance with counsel to introduce evidence at the Article 32 hearing. As a result, the commander, on the advice of the staff judge advocate, could say, this is not a case we should take. We've heard both sides. We don't even know to go to trial. As a result, the view among civilians is that trials in the military are a joke because the high rate of conviction says it's a joke, when in fact, the only cases that go that far are the ones that have already been screened with the defendant having a chance to be involved. Aside from the case I described of this young man, and I never to this day understood why he became the target of somebody, but other than that, I never saw a time when the commanders influenced what the JAGs did. I thought the JAGs had the opportunity to do things, do them well, do them professionally. They were trained well. The limitation for a young person coming in, which was sort of what I was beginning to feel, is that you're probably not going to practice law in the sense of being active in the courtroom or being active in counseling people after a certain period of time. And that generally means when you hit major, unless you get into DC, get into appellate work, get into really active contract work, international law work, but run-of-the-mill JAG, you become an administrator. It's not a bad gig. You don't have any malpractice insurance. You're not going to make the big bucks that I was blessed to have the chance to do when I got out. But I would say I enjoyed it. I have, except for that last episode, I would recommend to anybody, if you have a chance, do it.
Excellent. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about your military service or what you're doing now?
Well, no more about the military service. When I got out, I had the chance to continue what I was doing at the academy on the faculty. We taught all the cadets estate planning, in the sense that this is what a will is, this is what a power of attorney is. And I really got excited about that. And while I was at the academy, a major change in federal law in this regard, called the Tax Reform Act of 1976, was enacted. So when I left and joined my law firm, this has a little bit to do with the military. The first thing I was told was, well, today you're going to do litigation. Tomorrow you're going to do estate planning. The next day after that, you're going to do corporate work. Well, that happened for about 5 months. My friend and head of the law firm came to me one day and he said, what do you think? I said, I'm going back in the Air Force. He said, why do you say that? I said, you've made me a generalist. That's not what I wanted to do. I want to do estate planning and probate. Let everybody else do all the other things. And he agreed. And so I took a bunch of lawyers, at that time 7, when I left almost 35, but at that time 7, who had no idea about structure. They knew they were brilliant in many ways, but the idea of managing something didn't work. So I created a staff. I created divisions. I created what I would call my chief master sergeant, to handle my needs in the probate area, and set this structure up so that I was accountable, but I ran my own ship, to use a Navy concept. And as a result of that, I wound up teaching other lawyers on a state level, called continuing legal education. And I attribute a lot of what I was able to do in law school and in my practice to the disciplines I learned at the Air Force Academy. Aside from my parents and my faith, nothing else affected me positively like the Academy did. And I will be forever grateful for Congressman Mosier, who appointed me. That's my story, and I'm glad to share it.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. Welcome home.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Good luck. Keep doing a good job.
Thank you, Tom.